The test of the Platte River. The Great Plains had provided a brutal initiation, a month of sun-drenched, dusty monotony, broken only by the terror of cholera and the spectacle of the buffalo. But the true systemic challenge of the trail manifested not in the absence of water, but in its deceptive presence. The Platte River was legendary among the pioneers, a name whispered in the camps with a mixture of hope and fear. It was the crucial lifeline of the journey, the great, shallow artery that would guide the train for hundreds of miles. But the Platte, as Thomas Hale soon learned, was a natural deception, an obstacle that masqueraded as an opportunity. The deceptive giant. When the wagon train finally reached the Platte River, the sight was magnificent and terrifying. The river was nearly a mile wide, stretching from horizon to horizon, a massive, sluggish sheet of milky brown water. Yet, standing on the bank, it looked deceptively calm and shallow. Captain Jedediah Stone, however, wore a look of intense caution. He called the men together on the eastern bank, pointing to the slow, heavy flow. "Men, look close," Jedediah commanded, his voice tight. "The Platte is an honest river in its lies. It looks slow, but the current runs like a serpent under the surface. It looks shallow, but the bottom is treacherous quicksand. It is, as the trappers say, a mile wide and a foot deep, and yet a man can drown in it faster than any sea." The problem was simple. They had been traveling north, but the main trail required them to cross to the south bank to continue their path west toward Fort Laramie. The river, bloated by spring melt from the distant mountains, was at its most dangerous. Senator Silas Thorne, the wealthy, self-important man who still resented the captain's authority, immediately stepped forward. "Nonsense, Captain. Look at the water, barely up to a man's knee. We ford it now, swiftly, before the level drops and we mire ourselves in the mud." "Senator, you will hold your tongue," Jedediah snapped, his patience worn thin by the trail. "If we move now, we lose 5 wagons to the quicksand and every man who tries to save them. We scout first. We wait for the river to speak." The logistics of the crossing. The next day was a frenzy of preparation. Jedediah and his most trusted men, including Thomas, spent hours wading into the current, probing the bottom with long poles. Thomas's task was crucial. He had to test his Cooper's instinct against the water, determining which stretches of the riverbed offered firm passage and which were sinking traps of silt and sand. The findings were grim. The river was a minefield. The best route was a long, zigzagging diagonal, following a ridge of firm clay that ran beneath the surface. The reinforcements. Knowing the weight of the wagons would be their undoing, Thomas proposed a plan to Elias and the captain, using his knowledge of wood stress. "We need to create flotation, Captain," Thomas suggested. "The wheels will sink in the soft bottom. We must distribute the weight across the entire chassis. We cut the tallest, strongest cottonwood logs we can find and lash them securely along the sides and undercarriage of every wagon. They will act as outriggers, preventing the wagons from capsizing in the current and giving them just enough buoyancy to resist the pull of the sand." Jedediah, ever the pragmatist, agreed immediately. For 24 hours the men worked feverishly. Thomas, Elias, and Robert Blackwood, who, humbled by the cholera deaths, was now striving to prove his worth, chopped, planed, and lashed cottonwood logs to the wagon boxes. They used every length of spare rope and chain they possessed. The human sacrifice. The greatest challenge was the total wetting of all possessions. Everything had to be hauled out, wrapped in oilcloth, and stacked high inside the reinforced wagons. The women, especially Sarah Vance and the taciturn Esther Jenkins, spent the hours sewing extra layers of canvas over the weakest points, ensuring the precious food, flour, sugar, gunpowder, would not be ruined by the river. This was the true emotional test, submitting their entire survival to the mercy of the water. The crisis of leadership. The quicksand trap. The crossing began at dawn, a desperate, spectacular undertaking. The captain divided the 52 wagons into 4 groups, each led by a man who knew the scouted path. Thomas was assigned to the 3rd group, driving Goliath and his wagon, which was tethered to the much larger Vance wagon by a heavy chain. The first 2 groups made it across safely, though slowly, the water creeping over the floorboards of the lighter wagons, the men shouting constantly to keep the oxen moving. The success lulled the camp into a dangerous sense of security. Then came the disaster. In the 4th group, led by Senator Thorne, impatience trumped caution. Thorne, believing the captain's route too slow, had attempted to take a shortcut, cutting directly across what looked like a shallow, sandy stretch. Suddenly, the senator's magnificent lead ox stumbled and vanished almost up to its chest. The wagon, too heavy with its store of luxuries, immediately tilted, the heavy wheels sinking into the quicksand. The oxen panicked, yanking the wagon violently sideways. The air was filled with the terrible sounds of splintering wood and the guttural bellows of the terrified animals. The senator, standing on the high seat, screamed ineffectually. "The wagon is listing! The current's pulling it!" someone yelled. The train stopped dead. The problem was no longer Thorne's folly, but the danger to the train's discipline. If the rest of the column stopped to watch, the entire crossing would halt, risking nightfall and a dangerous, unorganized camp on the open riverbank. Jedediah Stone's voice, cutting through the chaos, was the sound of true leadership. 3rd and 4th groups halt. 1st and 2nd keep moving. Do not stop. He galloped back to the trapped wagon, leaping from his horse into chest-deep, swirling water. He ignored the senator, who was now weeping hysterically, and went straight to the animals. "Hale, Vance, get a line around that lead ox," Jedediah yelled. "We pull the animal out, then we cut the axle. We save the team." Thomas and Elias plunged into the water, fighting the current and the terrifying pull of the sandy bottom. Thomas found his feet sinking past his knees, a cold, helpless feeling of being swallowed alive. He relied on Elias, whose heavy frame gave him more purchase, to secure a rope around the struggling ox. But as they worked, the quicksand won the final victory. With a slow, mournful sigh, the senator's prized wagon, filled with furniture and silver, began to surrender. The cottonwood logs lashed to the side strained, then snapped. The wagon tilted fully, its contents, Penelope Thorne's vanity mirror, boxes of fine clothes, bags of grain, spilling into the murky water, to be carried away by the indifferent current. Thomas watched a velvet-lined box of silverware sink slowly beneath the brown surface. The material loss was staggering, a month's salary for half the camp lost in 30 seconds. They saved the oxen, and they saved the Thornes, dripping, humiliated, and now utterly dependent on the rest of the train. But the magnificent wagon, the symbol of the senator's ambition, was lost, swallowed by the Platte. The aftermath, a change in dynamics. The crossing was completed by nightfall, slow wagon by slow wagon, with the remaining emigrants sobered by the disaster. The cost of the river was not just one wagon, but the illusion of individual wealth and superiority. The Thornes, reduced from the wealthiest family in the train to the most dependent, were now a problem for the cohort. Captain Jedediah Stone, without emotion, ordered their surviving livestock and their soaking wet, meager salvaged possessions to be distributed among the remaining wagons. "Hale," said Jedediah, standing by the fire, his clothes steaming, "Thorne is yours. You and Vance take them in. Their life now depends on our charity and their labor. Use them well. They will not be welcome in any other company." Thomas looked at the senator, who sat huddled by the fire, shivering, his silk shirt torn. The man who had been a self-proclaimed leader
was now nothing but a refugee, stripped bare by his own arrogance and the river's brutal truth. The test of character. Taking in the thorns was the greatest test of the cohort's character. Sarah Vance, despite her natural disdain for Penelope Thorne's delicate airs, immediately took the sobbing woman in hand. "You'll not sit there and freeze, Mrs. Thorne," Sarah said, pulling off Penelope's ruined gloves. "Get into my wagon and change into something dry. You'll have to wear one of my old homespun dresses for a while, but it's wool and it's warm." Penelope, facing the choice between accepting charity and dying of exposure, followed silently. The exchange symbolized the new order. The old societal rules of class and wealth had been drowned in the Platte. Here, kindness was not a social grace, it was a necessary investment in the collective human resource. Thomas assigned Silas Thorne the most grueling, humiliating tasks, gathering water, hauling firewood, and cleaning the mule pens. He did so not out of malice, but to force the senator into usefulness. "You talk of being a leader, Senator. The trail doesn't care about your speeches. Leadership here is hauling the heaviest load and doing the worst job without complaint. Now tell me the truth. Is the wagon grease box on your old mule clean, or must I send you back to do it properly?" Thorne, for the first time, did not argue. He only mumbled, "I will check it again, Hale. It will be clean." The great politician was learning humility from a journeyman cooper, hammered into a new shape by the pressure of the trail. The psychological shift. Crossing the Platte marked a profound psychological shift for the entire train. They were no longer tourists playing at pioneers. They were survivors. They had faced a massive natural obstacle and passed through the crucible of loss. The sheer difficulty of the river crossing, the hours of planning, the cold, the terror, and the subsequent back-breaking labor of sorting and drying out supplies had changed the group dynamics for the better. The shared trauma had done what no amount of good cheer or preparation could. It had forged them into a reluctant but necessary single unit. The value of the specialist. Thomas's standing within the train was cemented. He was now universally recognized as the specialist, the man who could mend wood and metal, whose pragmatic ideas had saved several axles, and whose composure under pressure had been vital during the quicksand incident. Jedediah Stone, riding beside Thomas as the sun rose on the south bank, offered a rare slight smile. "You performed well, Hale," said the captain. "You saw the solution and you acted. That is the essence of this trail. There are two kinds of people on this road, those who complain about the problem and those who start fixing it." "I learned how to build a strong barrel, Captain," Thomas replied, looking back at the wide, silent river that had taken the Thorne's pride. He was no longer just Thomas Hale, the man running from Cincinnati. He was Thomas Hale, the capable cooper, the essential component of the wagon train's survival. He had paid the river its toll, but in return, the Platte had given him the greatest gift, the respect of the captain and the acceptance of his community. They had passed their first great test, and now, with the setting of their sights on the distant outline of Fort Laramie, the true heart of the continent lay open before them. They were battered, but they were unbroken. Whispers of conflict. The immediate aftermath of the Platte River crossing brought neither peace nor unity. While the shared danger of the quicksand had momentarily bonded the travelers, the lingering damp, the spoiled supplies, and the utter exhaustion soon turned that temporary cohesion into a brittle shell. The train had lost an illusion of security and gained a profound, nagging resentment, a simmering internal conflict that was always one misstep away from boiling over. The burden of the thorns. The primary friction point was the presence of the thorns. Senator Silas Thorne and his wife Penelope were now dependents, their possessions lost, their pride shattered. Their survival depended on the charity of the cohort, particularly the Vances and Thomas. Silas, stripped of his authority, performed his tasks with sullen resentment. He was inefficient, slow, and constantly muttered about the injustice of his fate. His wife Penelope was worse. She treated Sarah Vance, who had kindly clothed and fed her, not with gratitude, but with thinly veiled disdain. One afternoon, as Sarah was mending a tear in one of Elias's canvas bags, Penelope sat nearby, doing nothing but wiping her hands with a piece of lace salvaged from her drowned trunk. "I simply do not understand," Penelope sighed dramatically, loud enough for Thomas and Elias to hear as they greased the wagon wheels. "Why must we consume this mush every evening? In Kentucky, we ate fresh-killed poultry and cured ham. This journey is simply uncivilized." Sarah, who had not slept soundly in weeks and whose hands were cracked from the alkaline water, stopped sewing. Her expression was dangerously calm. "Mrs. Thorne," Sarah said, her voice low but piercing, "in Kentucky, your cook prepared your meal. Here, I prepare yours. And it is not mush, it is corn gruel, and it is keeping you alive. If you wish for better poultry, I suggest you grab the fowling piece and hunt it yourself. Otherwise, you will eat what is provided and say a silent prayer of thanks that you are not buried by the Platte." The exchange, witnessed by the other members of the cohort, hung in the air like gunpowder smoke. It wasn't just a squabble over food, it was a battle over social order. The frontier was dismantling the class structure Penelope desperately clung to, and her refusal to accept equality was poisoning the camp. Thomas, who had appointed Silas as his permanent reluctant apprentice, solved the problem with cold pragmatism. "Elias," Thomas called out, his voice loud, "take the senator with you to collect buffalo chips. He needs to learn the value of fuel." Collecting buffalo chips, dried dung used for cooking fires, was the most despised, filthy task on the trail. It was a chore no one could avoid, and Thomas ensured Silas did it twice as often as anyone else, forcing him to a physical confrontation with the grim reality of pioneer life. Silas complied, but the resentment in his eyes was palpable. He was a caged beast, waiting to regain his lost status. The whispers of distrust. The second, deeper tension involved Doc Healy. The doctor remained an enigma, aloof and intensely private. His medical skills were indispensable. He had saved 3 children from a persistent fever since the cholera outbreak, but his haunted demeanor fueled suspicion. Healy's presence in the train was constantly questioned by the more religious, superstitious families. "He does not pray at the evening circle," one woman whispered to Elizabeth Blackwood. "He burns strange herbs and speaks Latin when he tends the sick. He is too cold. He is not a healer, but a harbinger." The whispering campaign reached a peak after Healy, utilizing a rudimentary surgical kit, had to amputate the frostbitten toes of an old man from the 3rd cohort, a necessary but terrifying procedure. The old man lived, but the sight of the bloodied canvas and the sound of the victim's screams terrified the camp. Thomas, who often assisted Healy, defended the doctor. "Healy saves lives that would otherwise be lost. He's practical." "Practicality does not equal trustworthiness, Thomas," Elias countered, adjusting his rifle on his shoulder during guard duty one night. "The man is always alone. He pays too much attention to the route and not enough to the people. He carries no family, no history. What is a man running from that he chooses the wilderness to hide in?" The distrust was irrational but profound. In an environment where a shared past was a form of mutual collateral, Healy's lack of one was a dangerous vulnerability. Thomas kept his counsel, but he began to notice that Healy always rode slightly ahead of the captain, examining the ground with a hunter's keenness, and that he kept a double-barreled shotgun slung loosely across his saddle, a weapon far more suited for personal defense than for hunting game. The tense encounter, crossing the line. The internal conflicts were abruptly silenced by a collective, immediate threat, the train's second significant tense encounter with a Native American tribe. They had turned north from the Platte, moving along the bank toward Fort Laramie. The landscape was transitioning again, the green grass giving way to drier, harsher soil, dotted with sagebrush. It was here, in the open, vulnerable expanse, that they were intercepted. They had stopped for their midday rest when a small band of mounted warriors, likely Oglala Lakota, appeared on a distant rise. Unlike the silent previous Pawnee observers, this group rode with clear, confident intent, descending toward the train at a deliberate, non-aggressive trot. Jedediah Stone acted instantly. "Keep the cattle penned in, women and children inside the wagons. Men, draw your rifles, but do not, I repeat, do not sight the weapon. No one fires until I give the order." The scene was thick with silent terror. The emigrants, already on edge from the daily grind and their recent losses, were a hair's breadth from mass panic. The Lakota party halted 50 yards from the circle of wagons. They were formidable men, armed with long lances and bows, their faces stern and unreadable. The leader, a tall man whose chest was crossed with a bone-pipe breastplate, rode forward slowly. Jedediah, taking Thomas and Elias with him as armed backup, walked out to meet the leader in the space between the wagons and the riders. The conversation was conducted entirely in sign language, a slow, deliberate exchange that felt agonizingly long.
The Lakota leader signed, "Who are you? Why do you eat our grass and chase the buffalo?" Jedediah signed back, "We are travelers. We follow the great river to the far mountains. We seek new land. We do not seek conflict." The leader paused, his eyes sweeping over the wagons, the symbol of the white man's relentless hunger for land. He then signed a demand, pointing specifically to the oxen. "You have many strong animals. We are hungry. We take one bull." The request, though reasonable in the context of the vast hunting territory the settlers were traversing, was devastating to the train. Oxen were the engines of their survival, each one vital. To lose one was to delay the whole train, and delay meant disaster. The intervention of selfishness. Before Jedediah could offer a diplomatic counteroffer, perhaps 2 bags of coffee and some tobacco, Senator Thorne emerged from behind his assigned wagon. He had a small, finely carved box in his hands, one of the few treasures Penelope had carried through the Platte. Thorne, desperate to reclaim some sense of status and control, stepped forward, interrupting the tense exchange. He addressed the Lakota leader, speaking in English, his voice shaking with forced grandeur. "Sir, we are men of peace. Do not take the animal. Look, I offer you this fine music box instead. A treasure from the East. It plays a marvelous tune." He wound the mechanism, and a small, tinny, tinkling waltz tune floated into the vast silence of the prairie. The effect was instantaneous and disastrous. The Lakota leader looked at the ridiculous tinkling box, then at the desperate, sweating man, then back at the ox. He saw a man offering a trinket in exchange for a vital resource, a sign of deep misunderstanding and disrespect. With a motion of complete contempt, the leader signed, "Your box is the sound of foolishness. We take 2 bulls now." The line in the sand. Jedediah Stone turned on Thorne with an expression of pure, murderous rage. "You damned fool! You risked the whole train for a child's toy." The incident instantly escalated. 2 of the Lakota riders spurred their horses forward, lances lowered, heading directly for the ox pen. Jedediah had no choice. "Hale, fire 1 shot into the ground. Scare them. Do not hit a man." Thomas, rifle already in hand, took a deep breath. He aimed not at the men, but at the patch of dry dirt 50 feet in front of the riders. The muzzleloader roared, a burst of smoke and thunder.
The Lakota horses reared violently, surprised by the noise. The riders, professionals of the plains, instantly regained control, but the movement was enough. The standoff was broken. The leader, realizing the emigrants were willing to fight, raised his hand to his men. He looked directly at Jedediah, his expression a mixture of anger and a grudging respect for the captain's restraint, and then signed a final message, simple and chilling. "We go, but your train leaves a bloody trail. We will watch you bleed." They turned their horses and rode off over the bluff as swiftly and silently as they had come. The price of arrogance. The silence that followed was heavy with near disaster. Jedediah Stone, shaking with barely contained fury, walked straight to Senator Thorne and backhanded him across the face, sending the man sprawling into the dust. "You will not utter a sound, Senator," Jedediah hissed, standing over him. "You will not touch another weapon, and you will not offer another opinion. You almost cost us 2 oxen and the lives of 50 people with your arrogance. You are lucky I did not leave you for the Lakota." The rest of the camp watched in terrified silence. The internal conflict had been violently externalized, and the senator's fate was sealed. Later that night, the cohort held a grim meeting. The near loss of the oxen and the sheer terror of the encounter had realigned their priorities. The whispers of conflict were replaced by the cold, hard recognition of the cost of the incompetence. Thomas, sitting with Elias and Sarah, spoke plainly. "The senator's usefulness has expired. He is a danger. We must neutralize him." Elias, though uncomfortable with the harshness, agreed. He needs to be put where he can do no harm, but still contribute his labor. The decision was put to Captain Stone. The next morning, Jedediah announced the senator's new assignment, ditch digging. Silas Thorne was assigned to the rearmost wagon, where his only job, under the constant watchful eye of Esther Jenkins, was to follow the train, digging latrines and burying the camp refuse. It was the most solitary, backbreaking, and humiliating assignment on the trail. The final dynamic was set. The arrogant had been humbled, and the useful had been affirmed, and the entire train had received a bloody-knuckled lesson. The conflicts of the frontier were not polite disagreements. They were battles for survival, and the cost of losing them was paid by everyone. The trail had become harder, and the next stretch, Fort Laramie, was no longer a beacon of hope, but a critical, necessary objective to replenish their diminished spirit.
Fort Laramie, a brief respite. The approach to Fort Laramie was heralded not by a triumphant fanfare, but by the sight of dust clouds that were not their own, and the smell of wood smoke that carried the faint, sweet scent of civilization. After 6 long weeks of relentless marching, the sight of the fort, a squat, formidable structure of adobe and timber, was a mirage made real, a beacon of order in the immense disorder of the Great Plains. To the emigrants of the wagon train, Fort Laramie was more than just a military outpost. It was the psychological midpoint of the journey. It marked the end of the well-traveled, relatively less dangerous first half of the trail, and the beginning of the perilous, uncharted ascent into the Rocky Mountains. It was the last stop where they could hope to find true safety, proper medical aid, and vital supplies before plunging into the continent's interior. Arrival and the shock of cost. When Captain Jedediah Stone led the 51 surviving wagons into the temporary encampment outside the fort's walls, the sense of collective relief was palpable. The air was cleaner, the sight of uniformed soldiers reassuring, and the noise, though still loud, was the noise of commerce and authority, not the unpredictable sounds of the wilderness. Thomas Hale immediately went to his mule, Goliath, rubbing down its tired flanks and checking its hooves.
The mule, like its owner, was battered but sound. The first few hours were dedicated to rest and essential maintenance. Fires were built high, clothes were properly washed in the clear water of the Laramie River, and for the first time in weeks, the weary travelers ate a meal that didn't taste entirely of dust and desperation. The following day, however, the brutal reality of the stop became clear. Resupply was a financial slaughter. The fort's sutlers, merchants, knew they held a monopoly, and their prices reflected the life-or-death nature of the goods. Thomas went to the main store, a dark, crowded room filled with desperate pioneers. He needed 3 things: axle grease, essential for the mountain crossings, price 10 times the cost in Independence; quinine, his small stock had been used up by Doc Healy during the fever outbreak, price astronomical, sold by the grain, more valuable than gold dust; new iron rods. His spare iron was used to repair Senator Thorne's broken yoke. He needed more to prepare for the expected strain of the high country. $2 a pound for the iron, friend, the sutler, a greasy-haired man with cynical eyes, informed Thomas, and $25 for a small vial of the fever cure. Pay in coin or goods we can trade. Thomas was aghast. $2? I paid 20 cents a pound in Cincinnati. You're not in Cincinnati, the sutler replied, not bothering to look up. You are 6 weeks from anywhere, and your life depends on this iron. That's the price of the road, mister. Thomas realized the trail had simply traded physical threats for financial ones. He had a brief, painful argument with himself. He needed the iron, he desperately needed the quinine, but the cost would deplete his entire remaining capital. He compromised, purchasing a smaller amount of quinine and a single, heavy iron rod. He paid, watching his hard-earned savings melt away with a grim finality. He had crossed the continent only to be financially skinned by a fellow American. The great decision: Oregon or California. While the men handled the logistics, Captain Jedediah Stone faced the most difficult decision of the stop: which path to take. Fort Laramie was where the Oregon Trail truly diverged from the eventual route to California. Jedediah called a meeting with the cohort leaders and the most influential men, including Thomas, Elias, and even a humbled, silent Silas Thorne. Men, Jedediah began, pointing to a crude map stretched over a barrel. We have lost 4 souls to the trail and 2 wagons, but we are here. Now, the route. The main Oregon Trail goes due northwest from here. The path is known, the promise is farmland, but the distance is longer, and the weather is already turning against us. He tapped a point further south. Or we can follow the old trapper's path toward Fort Bridger, where the road splits. If we go southwest, we are aiming for the gold and easy weather of California. That path is less traveled, the water is less reliable, but the mountains are less of a total siege. The debate was fierce, fueled by fear and differing ambitions. The Oregon contingent, led by Jedediah. They were mostly traditional farming families like the Vances, who had committed to the agricultural promise of the Willamette Valley. They feared the moral chaos and rootless greed associated with the California gold rush. The California contingent, led by Senator Thorne, who suddenly found his voice again, arguing for the riches he hoped to quickly regain. Oregon is a farmer's dream, but California is a gentleman's chance. Gold. We are too late in the year to risk the long Oregon winter. We must choose speed and wealth. Thomas listened carefully. He had set out for Oregon, drawn by the vision of planting seeds in virgin soil, but the fear of the mountain passes, the true desolate wilderness beyond Fort Laramie, was a cold knot in his stomach. He looked at Elias Vance, whose eyes were fixed on the map, his loyalty clearly to Oregon. Thomas's calculated choice. When called upon, Thomas spoke not of faith or ambition, but of practicality and the wagon. "I came for Oregon, Captain, and I will continue for Oregon. The reasons are simple: water and forage. We have seen that the greatest threat is a lack of grass for the oxen and water for ourselves. The Oregon Trail, though longer, is documented to follow the great rivers and to offer more reliable feed for the animals. The California Trail is a desert route, a guess. We are too many people and too weak in supplies to gamble on a guess. We follow the well-watered path to the Willamette and rely on known terrain to survive the winter." His pragmatic appeal swayed several of the undecided families. They were pioneers, not prospectors. The promise of a stable home outweighed the lure of speculative gold. Jedediah brought his fist down on the barrel. "Then it is settled. We are the Oregon train of 45. Those who wish to risk the desert for the gold of California are free to leave, but you will not take our captain and you will not have our aid." Only 5 wagons, including the Thorns, who, despite having lost all their wealth, still dreamed of instant riches, chose to defect. Their departure was quiet, a final severing of an already strained relationship. Doc Healy's secret. In the midst of the repairs and the tense debate, Thomas witnessed a private exchange that offered a chilling glimpse into Doc Healy's secret. Thomas was working late, fixing a harness by the light of a small fire near the edge of the camp. He saw Healy speaking to one of the fort's soldiers, a man who looked nervous and kept glancing at the shadows.
Healy handed the soldier a small, heavy pouch, likely full of money. "You understand," Healy whispered, his voice intense. "No one is to know I was here. Tell anyone I was here, and I will find you, even if I have to ride back east on my belly." The soldier nodded frantically and scurried away. Thomas feigned ignorance, concentrating on his work, but his mind raced. Doc Healy was paying a soldier to erase his presence from the official records of Fort Laramie. The doctor was not just a restless soul, he was a man running from the law, or from something equally terrifying. The money he carried, the funds he used to buy his place in the train and pay for his secrecy, was not the earning of an honest man, but the ill-gotten gains of a desperate one. Later, as Healy approached the fire to check on Thomas's tetanus wound, Thomas spoke only of necessity. "Doctor," Thomas said, his eyes meeting Healy's over the flickering flames, "I am a man of my word. I see only what is necessary for the trail. Your skills are necessary." Healy looked at Thomas, the firelight casting sharp shadows on his haunted face. A long silence cast, filled only by the wind. Healy did not ask what Thomas had seen or heard. "Then we will continue to rely on necessity, Mr. Hale," Healy replied, his voice a low growl. "I rely on the silence of men who understand the difference between law and survival. Keep your eyes on the trail, and I will keep my eye on your health." The exchange was an unspoken contract. Thomas would not expose Healy's secret. Healy would remain the train's invaluable, if morally compromised, physician. The internal conflict concerning the doctor was resolved not by trust, but by mutual, pragmatic necessity. The final accounting. The day of departure from Fort Laramie was a somber one. The fort, which had seemed like salvation upon arrival, now felt like a final, isolated pocket of safety they were willingly leaving behind. Thomas stood with the Vances, readying Goliath. He looked at the departing California wagons, led by Silas Thorne, whose figure was now small and pathetic on the southwestern horizon, his wife trailing him on foot. They had chosen ambition over stability. Then he looked at his own train, now 46 wagons strong, a more disciplined, grimly determined column. "We go into the heart of the country now, Thomas. Elias said, tightening the ropes on the canvas cover. "No more forts for a long, long time. We are the law now." Thomas nodded, remembering the sutler's prices, the near disaster with the Lakota, and the desperate secret of Doc Healy. They had traded half their money, lost their false friends, and gained a painful clarity. He thought of Clara, his sister, back in the small, manageable cage of Cincinnati. He had sought the frontier to escape confinement, and he had found it, but this freedom was a heavy, terrible burden. The West did not offer liberation, it offered an acute, heightened form of responsibility. The captain gave the signal. The wheels creaked into motion, heading northwest, following the North Platte River. As they turned their backs on the fort, Thomas looked at the imposing dark shape of the distant Rocky Mountains, the next great physical obstacle. They were immense, jagged teeth waiting to crush the train's spirit. The great respite of Fort Laramie was over. They had rested, resupplied, and made their choice. They were on the Oregon Trail, and the real wilderness, the high country, lay ahead, ready to test the strength of every timber they had lashed and the resolve of every bond they had forged.
The high country, thin air and fear. Leaving the relative security of Fort Laramie, the Oregon train of 45 turned its back on the low plains and drove directly toward the formidable wall of the Rocky Mountains. The name itself, the Rockies, was a solemn vow of hardship, a geological declaration that the easy part of the journey was over. For Thomas Hale, the landscape shifted from a green ocean of grass to a jagged, implacable fortress of stone and ice. This was the high country, a domain of thin air, sudden violence, and profound, silent fear. The ascent, the grind of the grade. The trail immediately became a punishing vertical obstacle course. The gentle inclines of the Platte Valley gave way to steep, unforgiving mountain passes, where the wagon's wheels had to grind over massive boulders and through deep, rocky gorges. The pace of the march, once a reliable 2 miles per hour, plummeted. Every foot of elevation gained was a victory earned through sheer, burning muscle. The physical strain. The oxen and mules suffered terribly. Thomas, who had prided himself on Goliath's strength, watched the animal labor with a new, terrifying intensity. The heavy wagons, which had been manageable on the flat ground, became instruments of torture on the steep grades. "The air is too thin," Elias Vance gasped one afternoon, wiping sweat and dust from his eyes. He had been walking backwards, guiding his yoke of oxen, and his chest was heaving. "The animals can't pull a proper breath. Every step is 2 steps worth of effort." The men had to resort to double teaming and tackling. Double teaming. At the steepest points, the oxen from 2 wagons had to be hitched together to pull a single wagon up the grade. This meant Thomas and Elias would often join their animals, strain them to the limit to haul Elias's wagon up, then race back down to haul Thomas's wagon up. This process doubled the work and quadrupled the exhaustion. Tackling. On the most treacherous slopes, they had to unhitch the oxen entirely and use block and tackle, ropes and simple pulleys, to inch the wagons upward, hauling the heavy canvas boxes by pure, desperate human strength. Thomas, with his powerful shoulders and his skill with ropes and hitches, became indispensable. He worked until his hands were raw and blistered, the skin rubbed away by the thick ropes. The physical pain was a constant, dull companion, but it was the exhaustion that was truly debilitating, a bone-deep weariness that left no room for thought or hope. The air and the ailments. The altitude introduced new, frightening illnesses. The air grew cold and painfully thin, causing agonizing headaches, shortness of breath, and bloody noses. The nights were frigid, often dropping below freezing, forcing the pioneers to huddle together for warmth. Doc Healy, ever the pragmatist, treated the symptoms with grim efficiency. He bled a few of the more feverish patients, though Thomas suspected the relief was minimal. He preached the gospel of simple prevention. Don't overexert, drink all available water, and keep warm. The mental strain, the edge of despair. The mountains imposed a mental siege far crueler than the physical labor. The trail now snaked through deep, desolate canyons where the sun barely reached the ground. The constant sight was rock, gray, brown, and black, a monotonous, hostile landscape devoid of the nourishing green that had buoyed their spirits on the plains. The crushing silence. In the high country, the Great Plains' perpetual wind vanished, replaced by a profound, echoing silence. This silence amplified the internal fears of the emigrants. There was no longer the chatter of the plains. There was only the loud, rhythmic panting of the oxen and the ringing fear in one's own ears. It was during this time that Robert Blackwood finally broke. His initial idealism, already damaged by the Platte, shattered entirely. He had nothing left to trade for hope. One morning, the train woke to find Robert sitting silently outside his wagon, staring at the jagged peaks, tears freezing on his cheeks. He refused to move. "I can't go on, Thomas," he mumbled, his voice hoarse. "This is not freedom. This is God's tomb. We will die here. We will freeze and the wolves will pick our bones. We should have stayed in Pennsylvania. At least there the dying is quiet." Elizabeth Blackwood, his wife, stood over him, her expression a mix of sorrow and fierce resolution. "He will not move, Thomas. Not for me, not for the oxen." This crisis of will was a direct threat to the entire train. Jedediah Stone, riding up to the scene, knew that one visible breakdown could trigger mass despair. He dismounted, walking slowly toward Robert. "Robert Blackwood, you are an adult man. You have a wife and a commitment to the 45 wagons behind you. I will not tolerate this weakness." "I am finished, Captain," Robert yelled, his voice cracking with hysteria. "I will not move." Jedediah did not raise his voice or his rifle. He simply reached down, grabbed a coil of rope, and threw it to Thomas. "Hale, tie him to his wagon. Leave his hands free, but tie his legs so he can't wander. Elizabeth, you drive. He will walk beside his wagon until the mountain decides to move or he decides to walk." It was a harsh, humiliating solution. To treat an able-bodied man like a piece of baggage, but it worked. Robert, shamed and physically restrained, had his will taken from him, and the train moved on. The mountains demanded ruthless pragmatism, and Jedediah provided it. The dangers of the divide. Their objective was the South Pass, a vast, deceptively gentle break in the continental divide, the point where all American rivers begin their journey to either the Atlantic or the Pacific. The trail to the South Pass was known to be easier than the northern routes, but getting there meant surviving the intervening chaos.
The near calamity of the ascent. One afternoon, disaster struck Thomas's cohort on a sheer, rocky shelf. They were traversing a narrow path overlooking a 100-foot drop when a boulder, dislodged by the wagon ahead, rode down and struck the axle of Esther Jenkins's light wagon. The old axle, already weakened, splintered violently. The wagon immediately tilted outward over the precipice, Esther's mule panicking and threatening to pull the entire rig into the canyon. "Wagon down!" Elias screamed. Thomas reacted by pure instinct. He was nearest, holding Goliath's reins. He did not hesitate to use the block and tackle he had secured at Fort Laramie. With a powerful heave, he unhitched Goliath, secured a rope to the mule's saddle horn, and scrambled to lash the other end to the high side of Esther's tilting wagon. "Goliath, pull! Pull!" The mule strained, its hooves scrabbling for purchase on the smooth rock. The added counterforce from Goliath pulling the wagon away from the precipice, slowed the tilt just enough for Thomas and Elias to scramble beneath the rig and secure it with heavy chains to an immovable, low-lying rock. They saved the wagon, but the axle was shattered beyond repair. Thomas, the blacksmith. The repair became the focus of the entire camp. They could not move forward without fixing the axle. The sun was setting, and the high country cold was dropping rapidly. Thomas, for the first time, used the iron rod he had bought at Fort Laramie. He worked through the night, assisted by Elias and a newfound desperate Robert Blackwood, who was now eager to prove his worth. They used Thomas's portable forge, heating the iron rod until it was cherry red, hammering it into a solid sleeve to brace the shattered timber. The rhythmic clang, clang, clang of the hammer on the anvil, echoing through the canyon in the freezing darkness, was the only sound of life, a defiant statement of human persistence against the mountain's indifference. Thomas worked with a fierce concentration, the fire warming his face while his back was chilled by the mountain air. He was a cooper again, not of barrels, but of the very framework of survival. By dawn, the axle was patched, ugly, heavy, but solid enough to hold the weight. Esther Jenkins, who had watched the entire process in stony silence, walked over to Thomas. She opened her small leather purse and held out 2 silver coins, a magnificent sum. "For the rod and the labor," she said, her eyes, usually hard, holding a glint of respect. Thomas shook his head, pushing her hand away. "Keep your money, Mrs. Jenkins. On this trail, a life debt is worth more than coin. You owe me nothing, but you owe me full speed tomorrow." Esther only nodded, her respect now cemented by Thomas's refusal of the money. In the high country, value was measured in life, not silver. The South Pass, the spiritual midpoint. After days of relentless climbing and repair, they reached the South Pass. It was a disappointment, not a glorious snowy summit, but a broad, almost flat plateau, covered in dry sagebrush, almost indistinguishable from the plains below. The pass was defined not by its height, but by its meaning. Jedediah called the train to a halt. He did not ask them to pray. He asked them to look. "Look east," he commanded. "Behind us lies the Great Divide. Every drop of rain that falls there goes to the Atlantic. Look west. Before us the land falls toward the Pacific. The land now drains to Oregon." The psychological impact was profound. They had crossed the entire continent. They had overcome the greatest physical barrier separating the civilized East from the wild West. The fear was still present, but it was now tempered by a fierce, undeniable pride. Thomas stood on the crest, feeling the thin, cold air whip around him. He looked down the western slope. The ground was rocky and barren, but it was downhill. The hardest physical climb was done. But the mountain had taken its mental toll. Robert Blackwood was broken. Doc Healy's secret weighed on Thomas's mind, and the supplies were dangerously low. They had survived the thin air and the fear, but the mountain had consumed their resources. As the train began its descent, the mood was not of celebration, but of grim, exhausted realism. They were still alive, but they were deeply scarred. The high country had purged the weak and affirmed the strong, leaving Thomas and his cohort with a cold, clear understanding. The trail demanded not only physical power, but a ruthless ability to adapt and prioritize survival over sentiment. They were heading into the next trial, a period of potential famine and desperation, and they were doing so with nothing left to spare. The price of progress. The descent from the South Pass was deceptive.
The physical challenge of the climb was replaced by a more insidious, relentless enemy: desolation and famine. They were now moving through the Great Basin, a vast, high-altitude desert, sometimes called the Sagebrush Ocean. It was a land that promised nothing and delivered less. The tone of the journey had irrevocably shifted from one of arduous endurance to one of grim desperation. The awe of the high country had been replaced by a chilling realization. The trail demanded not just payment in sweat, but a price in blood and supplies that few were prepared to pay. The empty land, famine, and forage. In the Great Basin, the train faced its most critical challenge: a complete failure of forage. The sparse grass was bitter, woody sagebrush, unpalatable to the oxen and mules. The animals, the literal engines of their progress, began to weaken rapidly. "The oxen are failing, Captain," Elias Vance reported to Jedediah Stone one morning, his voice thick with fear. "They've lost half their weight since Laramie. They're too weak to pull a proper day's march." The weakening of the oxen created a terrible dilemma. The slower they moved, the more grass they ate, the longer the journey would take, and the closer they came to the devastating winter snows in the Cascades. Rationing the essentials. The human provisions were equally strained. The food bought at Fort Laramie was already half gone, and the lack of firewood meant meals consisted of cold, tasteless hardtack and rancid bacon. The lack of buffalo on this dry stretch meant hunting was futile. The men rode out daily, only to return with nothing but exhausted horses and grim faces. The few rabbits they managed to shoot were meager portions, distributed with agonizing fairness by Sarah Vance, who saw the hunger in every child's eyes. Thomas, witnessing the slow starvation of Goliath, began to feed the mule handfuls of his own precious cornmeal, a gesture of self-sacrifice that risked his own strength, but was necessary to protect his motive power. He was investing his own energy into the animal that carried his entire future. The loss of a dream. Robert Blackwood. The constant hunger and the endless barren landscape were too much for Robert Blackwood. Already fragile from his earlier breakdown, the desperation of the Great Basin pushed him beyond recovery. One night, during his solitary guard duty, Robert stole into the supply wagon of a neighboring family, a poor German couple with 2 young children. He took a sack of flour and a piece of salted pork. The theft was discovered at dawn. The atmosphere in the camp turned instantly toxic. Stealing food on the trail was the ultimate betrayal, a crime against the collective survival. It broke the unspoken contract of the journey. Jedediah Stone gathered the entire train. He stood before the silent crowd, holding the pilfered sack of flour. "A man among us," Jedediah announced, his voice booming across the desolate camp, "has attempted to save his own hunger by risking the starvation of others. He has broken the essential law of this trail. He has put himself above us all." Robert was dragged forward by his wife, Elizabeth, whose face was a mask of utter despair. "I was hungry, Captain. I was only going to take a small portion. We haven't eaten properly in days." "And what about the children, Blackwood?" Jedediah asked, his voice suddenly cold as the desert morning. "The children whose food you would have stolen. Do they not go hungry too? Your selfishness kills." The choice of punishment was agonizing. Jedediah could not hang him. That would consume valuable time and powder, and it would break Elizabeth. He could not merely banish him. He would surely die, and his death would weigh on their conscience. The captain's judgment was a masterpiece of frontier justice, focusing on the loss of the dream itself. "Blackwood, you are cast out of this wagon train. Your life is forfeit to your greed. However, for the sake of your wife, we will give you a single day's grace. You and your wife will take your wagon and you will drive it back along the trail until you meet another train or you die trying. You are not allowed to go forward to Oregon." Then he looked at Elizabeth. "Elizabeth Blackwood, you're not guilty of your husband's failure. You may stay. We will take you and your belongings into one of our wagons." Robert looked at Elizabeth, expecting her protest, her forgiveness, but Elizabeth's face was hard, the face of a woman who had seen her entire future shattered by a small selfish act. "I stay, Captain," she said, her voice clear and without a trace of a tear. "I came for a life in Oregon, not a death in the desert. My husband has chosen his own path." The final farewell was a brutal tableau. Robert Blackwood, alone, was forced to drive his wagon back east, his dream of a new life shattered by his own moral failure. He was sent back toward the only certainty of the frontier, slow death. But the worst loss was the death of Elizabeth's dream of a shared future. She had chosen a harsh, uncertain new life over a certain, failed love. The train watched him go in grim silence. The loss was a painful acknowledgment. The trail not only took lives, but stripped away the character of the weak. The price of progress was the ability to sacrifice sentiment for survival. The critical loss, Goliath. The loss that hit Thomas hardest was not human, but animal. His mule, Goliath, his single engine of ambition, was failing. Goliath had struggled through the high country and was now slowly starving in the Great Basin. The cornmeal Thomas had rationed to him was no longer enough. The mule was collapsing during the afternoon pull, his eyes dull with exhaustion. Thomas and Doc Healy spent a terrible night trying to revive the mule, but by morning, Goliath was clearly dying. He had succumbed not to disease, but to sheer, unforgiving famine. Jedediah Stone knelt beside Thomas. "Hale, you know the rule. If an animal can't stand, it becomes a burden. You have to put it down. Now." The captain's words were a cold spike in Thomas's heart. Goliath was more than an animal. He was the physical manifestation of Thomas's entire journey, the beast of burden that had carried him from the dusty streets of Cincinnati. Thomas stood up, his face expressionless. He took his father's rifle and walked to the mule's head. Goliath looked at him with gentle, exhausted eyes. "You were a good friend, old boy," he whispered, his voice rough. He raised the rifle. The shot, a sudden, final explosion of sound, cracked the morning silence. The loss of Goliath was a multi-layered disaster. Emotional loss, the single constant companion of the journey, was gone. Logistical loss, Thomas's wagon, still containing his precious cooper's tools, iron rods, and seeds, was now completely immobile. He had no ox and no money left to purchase a replacement. Moral loss. The need for fresh meat, Thomas, heartbroken, was forced to skin his own partner. The meat was tough and bitter, but it was protein, and it was distributed to the starving children of the cohort. The act of consuming his own means of progress, his mule, was the most devastating price of the trail. A new reality, dependence and humility. The loss of Goliath and the subsequent consumption of his flesh permanently shifted Thomas Hale's status. The self-reliant Cooper was now utterly dependent. Jedediah Stone, without consulting Thomas, solved the immediate logistical problem. "Your wagon, Hale, is too heavy to drag. You will sell every non-essential tool. Your iron, your spare clothing, anything that does not feed you or mend a wound, you will sell to the other wagons for cornmeal and flour. The rest of your essential gear, the seeds, the rifle, the remaining tools, will be carried by the Vance's oxen. You will be a foot soldier of this train, Elias's second hand, until you can earn or buy a new animal." The humiliation was profound. Thomas had been the most valuable man in the train, and now he was a baggage carrier, his future dependent on the kindness of the Vances and the mercy of his fellow travelers. He was forced to sell his copper kettles, his beloved draw knife, keeping only his small set of chisels, and his entire stock of spare iron rods, the insurance against the mountain passes. The wealth he had bought at Fort Laramie was traded back for a few pounds of flour. He gave his seeds, the true core of his Oregon dream, to Sarah Vance for safekeeping. "These are the only things I won't sell, Sarah," Thomas said, handing her the small linen bag. "They are my life. If I die, promise me you will plant them in the Willamette." "You will plant them yourself, Thomas," Sarah vowed, tucking the bag carefully into her own personal sack of valuables. Thomas had lost his independence, his faithful animal, and his friend, but he had survived. The price of progress had been paid in full. A moral failure from Robert, a complete emotional and financial stripping for Thomas. As the train moved on, Thomas walked beside Elias's wagon, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his hands now empty of reins, his vision of the self-made man blurred by the dust and exhaustion. He was no longer running toward an independent dream, but simply walking with a community for survival. The journey had become a communal, desperate march, permanently darkened by the knowledge that the wilderness showed no mercy, and progress was always bought at the highest cost.
An unexpected alliance. The loss of Goliath and the sight of Robert Blackwood's lone wagon receding into the desolate east had left the train subdued but unified. Thomas Hale, now a foot soldier walking beside Elias Vance's wagon, was humbled, his pride replaced by a quiet, fierce determination to fulfill his debt to the Vances and reclaim his future. Yet the emotional vacuum left by his mule was quickly filled by a rising, persistent unease regarding the train's most enigmatic figure, Doc Healy. It was the lack of anything familiar about the doctor that fueled Thomas's mistrust. The cold precision, the constant aloofness, and the chilling memory of the money for silence exchange at Fort Laramie. However, the unforgiving landscape was about to force a deadly convergence, binding the honest cooper and the haunted physician in a contract of desperate mutual survival. The ambush of the canyon. The train was moving through a jagged stretch of canyon land, a tributary cut deep into the earth, leading toward the crucial landmark of the Bear River. The terrain was hostile. Sheer, rocky walls offered perfect cover for attack, and the narrow passage forced the wagons into a single, vulnerable line. Jedediah Stone, keenly aware of the danger, had Thomas and Elias walking point, scouting the trail ahead. Doc Healy, who rarely accepted guard duty, suddenly appeared on his horse, riding silently alongside Thomas. "The air is too still, Hale," Healy said, his voice a low rumble, his eyes scanning the canyon rim. "And the birds have gone silent. This land is holding its breath." Thomas nodded, gripping his rifle tightly. He felt the same predatory silence. The attack, when it came, was not a massive raid, but a swift, terrifying hit-and-run orchestrated by a small band of renegade raiders, not a tribal war party, but outlaws looking for livestock and quick plunder. They did not appear over the rim, but sprang from a hidden crevice in the rocks directly ahead of the vanguard. 3 men on horseback, faces obscured by bandanas, opened fire, the sound of their pistols deafening in the confined space. They were aiming for the oxen. "Back to the train! Protect the yoke!" Thomas screamed, shoving Elias backward. Thomas raised his father's rifle and fired a single, practiced shot. The bullet struck the lead raider's horse, sending the animal crashing to the ground. The sudden chaos caused the oxen to stampede. The wagons lurched violently. In the confusion, a heavy supply box tumbled from Elias's wagon, striking Doc Healy's horse. The horse whinnied in pain and collapsed, throwing Healy against a sharp rock face. The raiders, seeing the fallen animals, shifted their focus from plunder to blood. Two of them dismounted, running toward the immobilized group, their knives drawn. The contract forged in blood. Thomas found himself pinned behind the fallen horse, his rifle empty, struggling to reload the muzzleloader. The two raiders were upon him. "Vance, cover!" Thomas yelled, working frantically to prime the powder. Elias was struggling with his pistol, but a raider was already past him, lurching over the fallen horse. Just as the raider raised his knife, a loud, thunderous crack erupted from the dust. Doc Healy, lying injured on the ground, had fired his double-barreled shotgun. The blast was devastating. The raider flew backward, his knife clattering on the rocks. "Reload, Thomas," Healy yelled, throwing the spent shotgun aside. He was nursing a rapidly bleeding gash on his temple, but his eyes were sharp and focused. "They're flanking us." The third raider, seeing his comrades fall, retreated to his horse on the canyon rim, firing a final warning shot before galloping away. The silence returned, but this time it was a silence thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood. Thomas rushed to Healy, kneeling beside the injured man. "Doctor, your head. You took a nasty blow." Healy pushed Thomas's hand away with surprising strength. "The head is fine, but the shotgun." Healy's right shoulder, where he had instinctively absorbed the recoil of the powerful blast, was dislocated. The white curve of the joint was visibly wrong beneath his coat. "You need to set it, Hale," Healy gritted out, his face pale with pain. "Now, before I pass out, get my medical bag from the pack mule. There is a small vial of laudanum, the one with the blue stopper. Give me the whole dose and get a strong piece of wood." The unspoken bargain. The process that followed was gruesome and intense, a terrifying violation of the doctor-patient hierarchy. Thomas, though he possessed the Cooper strength needed for the manipulation, was no surgeon. He was working on the man who was both his cohort's most valuable resource and his deepest mystery. He gave Healy the laudanum, which the doctor swallowed without a blink. As the drug began to cloud his senses, his guard dropped, and he muttered in a painful delirium, not about his injury, but about his fear. "They will be looking for the money, Thomas," he slurred, his eyes rolling back in his head. "Not the doctor, the money, and the papers. Don't let them have the papers. I have to make it to the coast. I have to change my name."
The doctor had confirmed Thomas's worst suspicions. Healy was a fugitive, and his medical expertise was merely a disguise for a life on the run. The money and the papers. Thomas suddenly understood that Healy was carrying something far more valuable than gold. He was carrying proof of his past, a document he needed to destroy or leverage. The laudanum took effect. Healy's muscles relaxed. Thomas, using a heavy leather belt for leverage and a strong piece of elm wood for counterpressure, gripped the dislocated joint. He said a quick, silent prayer to the god of carpentry, the god of the honest line, and with a sickening, audible thunk, he forced the shoulder back into its socket. Healy screamed, a raw, primal sound that was instantly cut short by the return of the delirium. Thomas quickly bound the shoulder tightly across Healy's chest. "You are safe for now, Doctor, but your secret is not." The covenant of necessity. When Healy woke hours later, the sun was setting and the train was slowly moving again. He was lying inside Elias's wagon, his face drawn. Thomas sat beside him, cleaning the doctor's leather satchel. "You saved my life, Hale," Healy said, his voice thin, testing his shoulder. "We saved each other," Thomas replied, cleaning the surgeon's small silver scalpel.
and you confirmed a few things I suspected. The money, the papers, the haste." Healy looked at Thomas, fear mixing with a terrible fatigue. "If you turn me over, Hale, you lose your doctor, and I lose my life. I am a wanted man, not for murder, not for theft, but for sedition. I printed pamphlets against the former president's war in Mexico. I was declared an enemy of the state." The revelation was shocking. Thomas had expected a criminal, not a political dissident. It complicated his moral equation. Healy was not a simple thief. He was a man who had sacrificed his life for his conscience, a different kind of ambition from Thomas's own. "Sedition is a serious charge, Doctor," Thomas said slowly, "but your life is your own. I am a man who came west to escape the politics of the East. I care nothing for your pamphlets. I care only for the well-being of this train." Then he laid out his terms, forging the unexpected alliance, a practical covenant between two men bound by mutual necessity. "You are a fugitive, and you are now half crippled. You cannot ride the horse you are now without pain, and you cannot use a weapon effectively. But you still have your mind and your medicines. What do you propose?" Healy asked, pulling himself up slightly. "I propose a trade. I become your hands. I ride your mule and your pack-horse. I become your shadow, your protector, your silent guard against the law you fear. In return, you continue to be the train's doctor, and you use your knowledge, your advanced costly medicines, to ensure the health and survival of my cohort, the Vances, Mrs. Jenkins, Elizabeth Blackwood, and myself. When we reach the Pacific, you are free to go wherever you choose, and I will be silent. Do we have an agreement, Doctor?" Healy looked at Thomas, weighing the terrible risk and the immense benefit. He saw not morality, but cold, hard efficiency. Thomas Hale was not interested in judgment, only survival. Healy slowly extended his good left hand. "We have an agreement, Hale. From this day forward, you are my shadow, and I am your shield of medicine. But understand this, I trust no man, and I will kill any man who breaks this bargain." Thomas shook his hand, a hard, brief grasp that sealed the pact. The honest Cooper and the hunted doctor were now partners. The new dynamic. The unexpected alliance immediately changed Thomas's status again. He was no longer just a foot soldier. He was the doctor's guard. He began riding Healy's small string of animals, and in his own heart he recognized the irony. He had lost his own mule to starvation, only to gain two in a bloody exchange. He had been stripped of his independence, only to find a new, dangerous form of self-reliance, riding beside the train's deepest secret. Healy, now physically dependent on Thomas, began sharing his vast knowledge, not of politics, but of the trail. He taught Thomas the medicinal uses of the sagebrush, how to detect poisoned water by its taste and smell, and the brutal truth of emergency surgery. The mistrust was gone, replaced by a deep, pragmatic respect. Thomas and Healy had survived an ambush, and in the process had found the unexpected key to their futures. They were two men with diametrically opposed values, one seeking a quiet home, the other seeking oblivion. But both were bound by a shared secret and a single desperate contract. To survive the unforgiving trail, they had to trust the very person they had once most feared. The journey had become a silent, high-stakes conspiracy.